Hello class, and welcome to the final section on project management. We've looked at cost management, we've looked at time management, quality management. We also looked earlier in the semester at project initiation and project teams. This is the final section, and it's just going to be a one-off lecture on risk management. This is in fact your final lecture. The next lecture, I plan to do this during the tutorial, and it will be basically a review of everything we've done over the last 3 weeks. So we're going to be looking at risk management today. Now, I just need to give you a prior warning that risk management is a huge subject, and really I think in a typical undergraduate module in project management, we should probably be giving 3 to 4 lectures on risk management. So I apologize for this. This is going to be very much general and very much surface level what we're doing, but that's just the reality of doing 9-week semesters online as opposed to a 13-14 week semester in class. So I'm just going to give you a very general overview of risk management here. So in this section on risk management, we're going to be talking about what are some of the typical risks that are faced in civil engineering projects. We're also going to be talking about how do you identify risks, how do you assess them, and then how do you respond to project management risks. So basically, how do we manage them? And so we're going to talk about the importance of being proactive rather than reactive in our risk management. If we can plan ahead of time, if a risk occurs, if it eventuates, do we have a plan set in place to deal with it? We're also going to talk a little bit about subcontracting and insurance as 2 ways of managing risk. So basically, when we talk about risks, we're talking about things which may or may not happen in a civil engineering project that can affect the project's delivery. It can affect any of the 3 constraints. It could affect the cost, it could affect the time, it could affect the quality. So the 3 constraints of the project management triad can be affected if a risk eventuates. Now, risks are completely inevitable in civil engineering. For any project, there are risks. If there were no risks, then there wouldn't really be any profit or benefit in carrying out the civil engineering project. Risk is just part of life. Now, how do we deal with risk? Well, we're going to be talking about this later, but there's basically 4 different ways we can manage a risk. We can avoid a risk, we can reduce a risk, we can transfer a risk, we can accept a risk. Those are the 4 things we can do. But what we cannot do is ignore risk. We need to manage and be proactive in our management of our risks. Now, that normally begins at the planning stage. So if you remember about project life cycles, which we did way back in week 1, week 2, risk management, we would normally do this in the planning stage, and it would normally come about after we've done the WBS, the work breakdown structure. And when we identify the risks, basically we categorize them by 2 categories: their impact and or cost, and their likelihood or probability. So likelihood or probability is basically the probability that something will happen, that a risk will occur. And the impact is basically the weight of cost to the project. And that cost could be in poor quality, it could be in monetary cost, or it could be in time delay. So for example, let's say you're building a high-rise building. What is the risk that you have an earthquake and the building collapses before you can finish it and strengthen it for earthquake loads? Well, that's a very low likelihood, isn't it? Or low probability. It's probably 0.1%, 1 in 1,000. But it's actually very high impact. It's going to create big time delays, big cost, and may even impact the final quality of the building. So big impact, low likelihood. Other risks may actually have smaller impacts but higher likelihoods. An example would be something like okay, the chief engineer gets sick, he has the cold for a week and he can't work, and that delays the delivery of the design work by 1 week. Well, the likelihood of that is quite high. I would say 1 in 10, 10%. Potentially 1 in 10 people get sick every week for maybe a week or so every year, just with colds and so forth. The impact, though, will be quite small, especially if there's some slack in those activities. So keep that in mind too. So remember the project management triad, how we've got 3 constraints of cost, time, quality. They all influence one another and they eventually determine what is the project scope. Well, I'm going to give you another triad here. This is called the risk management triad. So the risk management triad means that when a risk occurs, you could have any of these 3: cost overruns, time delays, or poor quality. Now remember, with poor quality, I'm talking about quality which is less than the original scope. I'm not talking about low quality, because potentially you've decided to build something to low quality, so it will be low cost and short time. But poor quality is when you have failed to reach the scope. So remember what we talked about last week about standardized quality and unstandardized quality. All of these risks, if they eventuate, they could lead to a change in the scope. And so if you are a project manager, you're basically always trying to keep the project to the cost, time, and quality constraints. And the things which work against you, those are actually risks. They could lead to cost overruns or time delays or poor quality. So in essence, in a way, all project management is essentially risk management. So let's look at an example here. Let's say you are on the project team for a design build contract to design and build the Amidi Tunnel. So this is a project that has been on in the planning stage for a number of years now with the Ministry of Transport. What this is it's going to be this big tunnel that is going to start at Zawita, and it's going to come out on the other side of the mountains, quite close to Amidi, I believe, or underneath Amidi, actually, into the Barzan Valley. That's my understanding. It's going to be about a 20-kilometer long tunnel, and basically it's going to mean that all of those places around Barzan, they're going to be a lot closer to Dohuk in terms of transport time. At the moment, it takes them a good half an hour to drive over the mountain and go to Dohuk for work, but now with this tunnel, it'll probably reduce it to about 15 minutes. So that's the Amidi Tunnel. I believe they're planning to start the design and build of this reasonably soon. They've just finished doing the Peramam Tunnel, the Massif Tunnel, and this will be the next tunnel on the big plan. Now, with a project like this, building tunnels, it's a very slow process of digging a tunnel, I'll have to say. So they're planning that this project, the design and the build of it, it's going to be about 7 years. And it's also very high cost. tunnels cost a lot of money to build. It's going to cost around $1 billion. So this gives you some idea of the time, cost and quality of this project. Now, pause the video and think about this. What are some of the risks you may encounter with this project? I want you to just try and have a brainstorm by yourself and just think up maybe half a dozen to a dozen risks that you might encounter. Okay, well, this is my list that I came up with. This is 6 risks that I thought of that we would definitely face that could eventuate in the Amidi Tunnel project. Now, if you are in a project team for the Amidi Tunnel, I can tell you with a project of this size, the risk register that you would be formulating in the planning stage, that would have hundreds of risks that you would brainstorm and try and plan for. There would be hundreds of risks, maybe even over 1,000. I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to keep this very simple and just give you 6 risks. It's not realistic of a project of this size though. But here's one risk. The project, when it's about to be finished, it's 1 year from project completion. The population of the Barzan Valley has grown twice as fast as expected. Well, what's the project risk there? Well, it's basically that the tunnel which you were building for a certain population, it may not actually be big enough for the population of Barzan if it's going to grow very quickly. That I can tell you now that the KRG is a very popular place to live. It may not seem that way at times, but you've got people from Turkey, Iran, southern Iraq, they all want to move to the KRG. It is one of the most economically healthy places in the region, and Dohuk potentially is probably one of the wealthiest cities for maybe a 1,000 kilometer radius, quite possibly, and so that could lead to a very strong population growth if it's not controlled. So that could mean that the project doesn't deliver the quality that you intended. Number 2, you could unexpectedly hit hard, strong granite that the tunnel boring machine can't cut through. So the tunnel boring machine, this is basically a big piece of machinery which is cutting through the underground and digging through the tunnel. It's like a big giant mechanical worm that is digging through the underground. Now, if you hit hard granite, potentially the tunnel boring machine that you have isn't strong enough to break through the granite, and suddenly you need to look at doing something like dynamite or getting another tunnel boring machine, and that could be very expensive and cause big delays. Number 3, the Ministry of Transport has to postpone the project because of lack of funds. Boy, isn't that a risk that often eventuates in Kurdistan. We've talked a lot about that when we talked about time management. But yeah, the Ministry of Transport runs out of funds, usually because the government does not keep a lot of reserves. They don't have money kept in the bank. They normally just keep oil in the ground. And so if the price of oil drops, suddenly there's not nearly as much money as they thought there would be. That's sort of how the KRG operates at a government level. And so if you have to postpone the project, well, that's going to create big time delays. That could really affect the cost as well. It may actually affect the quality as well, because if the population is growing in that time, potentially the tunnel is not going to be as effective for transporting the population of Barzan when it's finished. So that's a big risk too. 4, this is probably a smaller impact risk, but yeah, the chief engineer dies. So the engineer who was most in charge of design, he dies, and because he was very bad at documenting, and the drawings and the specs weren't written up fully, much of the knowledge of the design details, they're lost. They only existed in his head. Well, that's going to create a lot of delays, because basically you're going to have to redo a lot of the design work. So that's a little bit of a risk too. Now, number 5, if there's bad weather in the winter, because it gets very snowy in that part of the KRG, when things are snowy and cold, basically people are not going to be working quite as long hours during the day. They're going to be working slower. And so the construction activities take a lot longer than expected. So there's going to be time delays, which will lead to cost overruns and other things. Number 6, because of a lack of expansion joints, you know about expansion joints because you did building materials. Expansion or contraction joints is another name for them. Some of the concrete in the lining of the tunnel, that starts shrinking as it goes hard, and cracks emerge in the concrete. So that's going to affect the quality. Is it going to be... now, with these 6 risks, some of them might be very high likelihood and low impact. Some of them might be high impact, low likelihood, and some of them might be high likelihood and high impact. But this would come about with just the brainstorming of the project team in the early stages of the project. We normally do this after we've written the work breakdown structure, because that helps us identify certain risks. We can often determine what risks are applicable to different work packages, for example. We would be brainstorming this as a team, and then we will be basically analyzing them for impact and likelihood. So that's what we're going to do now in the next few slides. Oh, I forgot. So see this video here? This is actually a video of a tunnel boring machine. So this is a tunnel, and basically you've got a big worm that cuts through the underground, and all of the rubble gets taken out the back by a conveyor belt, and also a precast concrete lining is stuck to the side of the wall, and so you're creating your concrete lining as you go through the tunnel. So yeah, that's one way that you can dig a tunnel. That's by far the most common way. The other way is with dynamite, but that's not favoured these days. Nearly always people prefer to use these tunnel boring machines, and they can be absolutely huge. I have seen one that had a diameter of that blue disc at the front with all of those sharp teeth to cut through the underground and the rock. I saw one that had a diameter of 38 meters. So they can be absolutely colossal, these things. They are huge, huge pieces of machinery. So with the risk assessment, we will be assessing the risks normally at the planning phase. And this is because at the planning phase we normally have the benefit of having a work breakdown structure, which you remember from week 1 and 2. And basically the best way to assess risks is to list them by brainstorming. And the best brainstorms happen in a team, when you're all sitting together and you're talking about all of the possible risks and listing them out. You're not looking at impact or probability at this stage. You're just trying to make a big list of all of the risks. And the best way to identify risks is actually to draw from previous experiences from projects that are similar to the current project. Now, once you have a list of all of the risks, you will then analyze the risks for their impact. What will be the impact on cost, time, and or quality? And then you would also be analyzing the probability or the likelihood of that risk eventuating, of that risk becoming a reality. So you've got all of these risks, you've got what the risk is, you then have the risk's impact and the risk's probability. And then basically these risks are recorded in a document which is usually called the risk register, or increasingly it's called the risk database because it's usually online. Now, this will first be written at the planning stage, but the truth is the risk register will always be continuously updated, similar to estimates, which are always refined as you go through the project. The risk register is continuously being updated. New risks are being added, old risks are being eliminated if they're no longer risks. The size of the impact is reanalyzed and given a more accurate value. The probability is refined further, and so it's an ongoing process. So this is basically what the risk assessment will look like. You will be identifying risks together as the project team put in charge of the risk management committee, and identifying risks, you're basically using two inputs. You're using the work breakdown structure, but also a risk assessment checklist. Basically, this is key questions to ask. What would happen if this happened? What would the impact be? What would the likelihood be? Has this happened on previous projects of similar type? You list all of the risks, and then you go into assessing the risks. And basically, those are two different things you'll be doing. You'll be assessing the probability of occurrence and the likely impact. Now, this is a very simplified risk management process. Potentially, one risk could have varying levels of impact. So, the impact of the concrete being low quality, well, that could be 20,000 with a probability of 50%, or it could have an impact of 100,000 with a probability of 5%, and so it could vary. And I'm not going to go into those details. Basically, once you go into those multivariable analysis and interactions, you need to use a specialist software, something like RiskMan or Minitab. Minitab, that's a piece of software that Yvonne has some familiarity with from her final year project. But we're not going to go into that. That gets very technical, and you need to look into statistics at quite a high level. We would be doing that if we had 4 lessons or so with risk management. We don't. So we're just going to assess that these risks have 2 variances, probability and impact, and they are not interacting with one another. The impact does not influence the probability and vice versa. And then from that, we will rank the risks. We will rank them from the big risks to the little risks, and that will basically become the basis of the risk register. So this is the risk register for the Amidi Tunnel project. Now, this is a very simplified risk register, okay? I want you to understand that, but I've ranked these risks after assessing them. So the first risk, the biggest risk, is that there is granite is encountered, and that means we're going to have to replace the tunnel boring machine with a much stronger tunnel boring machine. And remember, these are huge pieces of machinery. To import a brand new tunnel boring machine that is stronger into the KRG, that's going to cost a lot of money. It's going to cause a lot of delays, and I've assessed that the impact will be $15 million. So that's the impact that will be caused both by the cost overrun of getting a new machine, but also the time delay and the cost of that. And the likelihood of this happening is 20%. Now, I'm using percentages for likelihood. You don't need to, but that's how I'm doing it. And then I'm valuing the risk. Now, the way that I'm going to value risks is actually I'm just going to multiply likelihood by impact. Very simplified analysis here. Again, you don't need to actually do it that way. Many risk registers would have much more complex formulas, but the value here is 20% times 15 million. The value of this risk is 3 million. Risk number 2 is if there is a postponement because of a lack of funds. Well, remember, if there is a if there are any time delays for big projects, that can actually have a very big impact on the value of a project, because time delays mean that you're losing a lot of external benefits. So remember, we're valuing external benefits here as well, because it's a public project. So the impact of a delay of maybe 1 year would be $20 million. Now, the likelihood of that happening is 5%. Potentially, you want to reassess that later. I would say, looking at the history of projects in the KRG from the Ministry of Transport, projects being postponed because of a lack of funds, it happens on a very regular basis. I would say the likelihood is 50% or higher. But anyway, let's say it's 5%, so the value of that risk is 1 million. Number 3, bad weather delays the winter construction. Well, the impact would basically be in time delays, and that would be 3 million. And the probability of that is 25%, a 1 in 4 chance, so the value is $750,000. The death of the chief engineer, well, the impact there would be 500,000, and the likelihood is 10%. Gosh, there's a 10% chance he could die during the course of the project. That's a problem. Now, shrinkage cracks, so the value would be 50,000. Shrinkage cracks. Now, this is one of those risks which is very low impact, but quite high likelihood. The impact is quite small, $100,000 in lost quality or time delays or costs to get new concrete. I'm not sure. But the likelihood is pretty high. Shrinkage cracks, they're a pretty common occurrence. So let's say 50%. So the value is 50,000 as well. And then there's unprecedented Barzan population growth. Because of coronavirus, they're at home and they have more babies. And so obviously the impact of that could be 2 million. Maybe the tunnel is just not going to be big enough for all of the cars that are going to be using it. The likelihood of that happening, though, is pretty small. We're very good at measuring population growth. There isn't too much variation, and we're very good at it. So very low likelihood, 2%. So the value is 40,000. Guys, this is a very simplified risk register. There's lots of different ways you can do the risk register. You can make them a lot more complex than this. There's lots of different clauses that you can put in. There's lots of advantages and disadvantages, but I just don't have time to teach you that. So I'm just teaching you the very basics of a risk register. And this is enough for you to have the rudimentary understanding to be a good project team member. If you want to specialize in risk management or be in charge of risk management in the future, you're going to have to educate yourself to more depth than this. But this is one example of a risk register. So this is actually going to be made available on Moodle for you. This is basically a port that is being built in Townsville. So Townsville is a city in Australia, and they're basically building a new port for ships to come in and to load off their containers. And so you can see there on the left they've got risks. And they've also categorized the risks in terms of climate risks, land risks, cost risks, I'm sure. And then the next task, the next column is the potential consequence. And they've not put a value on that risk, okay? They've just explained what the consequence is. And then they've basically given a likelihood. And so they're not giving a percentage here, they're just giving a likelihood of possible, improbable, likely, unlikely, and they will probably have a key explaining how they determine what the likelihood is for those risks. Consequence, again, they're giving a qualitative measure, not a quantitative, not putting a value. Major, and then they've got a risk rating, and again it's qualitative, high risk, low risk, moderate, negligible, so on. They will have a key describing how that's done. The next thing that would happen is basically doing risk management. So that's in the right hand column. I'm not going to get to that now, but you can read that later if you want. So let's just look at one example. Let's look at the second risk on this page. Flooding caused by a storm surge. What's the potential consequence or impact? That is that there would be destruction to buildings and infrastructure. The likelihood of it happening is, well, it's possible. The consequence, it has been classed as being major, and so the risk rating is rated as high. Now you can then go into the risk management of that, and potentially how they're managing that is they're designing the infrastructure to withstand cyclone ratings, and so that means that it reduces the consequence from being major to minor, and that means that the new risk profile has gone from being high to low. That's a very simple, that's how they've done their risk management in their risk register. We haven't got to management yet, we're just doing risk assessment at this stage with our risk register. Now, a couple of notes on risk assessment. Some risks can influence the probability or impact of other risks if they occur. Now, this is called dependence, or another word for this is interactions. And this is a statistics term. So let's say that there is a risk of the tunnel collapsing, and the probability of this is 1%, and the impact is $500 million. So it's very high impact, very low probability. However, you've got another risk that some of the concrete has shrinkage cracks. Now, the cost of that, the impact is, let's say, 100,000, but the likelihood is 25%. So this is a low impact, high probability risk. However, if you have cracks in the concrete, that can actually influence the probability of the tunnel collapsing. So one risk, if it occurs, can influence the probability of another risk occurring. So this is something that would come out in a multivariable analysis. Now, we're not doing that. This is where risk assessment really needs to use what you've learned in statistics and probability assessment. We're not doing that because I only have one lecture. But that's something to be aware of, is that one risk can influence the other. I'm not going to give you examples of that, but you just need to be aware that that could happen, and that's something you need to learn in a deeper level if you're involved in a risk assessment yourself later on. Now, impacts, they could actually be impacts on the cost constraint, time constraint, or quality constraint. Now, if you're quantifying the impacts, it can be a little bit difficult to quantify and give a dollar value to the cost of a time delay or the cost of poor quality. That can be hard to quantify, and we talked a lot about that when we talked about cost-benefit analysis, when we talked about feasibility studies way back in week 2. The same problem exists with risk assessment. The other thing is that risk registers, they will prioritize which risks need to have the most careful management. If a risk is way down on the list and it's risk number 283, you're not going to invest as much time into trying to manage that risk as risk 1, 2, and 3. Remember that this example I've given you with 6 risks is that's piddly. Usually a civil engineering project will have hundreds of risks. So I've given you an example of the Townsville port being built, the new terminal. That's on Moodle. Have a good look at that, and you'll see there's actually dozens upon dozens of risks for that risk register for that civil engineering project. Now, it's very good to engage with stakeholders when assessing risk. Just like it's good to assess with stakeholders when trying to assess the costs and benefits of a project in defining the project scope at the feasibility stage or the project definition stage. The same benefits of consulting wide exist with risk assessment. They can help you really put a good value on the impact and also the probability of each risk, and also potentially identify risks that you would not have identified if you were just left with a small risk management team of 3 or 4. So after we've identified the risks and assessed them for impact and probability, the next step is we need to actually manage the risks. Now there's 4 different things we can do to manage a risk. We can avoid the risk, meaning that we're basically bringing the probability down to 0 and getting rid of the risk somehow. We can reduce the risk, and this could be a reduction in both the impact or the probability of the risk. Or we can transfer the risk, which means that potentially the impact of the risk is being passed on to some other party, some other entity. There is a 4th thing we can do, and that is accept the risk. But we won't go into that because 1, 2, and 3, avoid, reduce, transfer. What we're doing here is we're changing the profile of the risk. We're changing either the impact or the probability or both of the risk. So remember, certain risks may have high probability, high impact, low probability, high impact, or low probability, low impact. Is that everything? I guess you could have sorry, high impact, low probability. Yeah, high probability and low impact is the other one there. I've missed that. And that will determine how you manage the risk, because remember, avoiding the risk reduces basically brings probability down to zero, if that's possible. Reducing the risk, depending on how you're reducing the risk, you're either reducing probability or impact or both. And transferring the risk, you're transferring the impact of the risk. So let's look into that and look at some examples. So with risk management, we've already come up with the risk register. We've looked at that flow chart that was in blue for risk assessment. Now we're going into risk management. So we have the risk register, and we now need to make a strategy for each risk on how we're going to manage it. And so one way is we can avoid the risk. So how do we avoid the risk, let's say, that shrinkage cracks will occur? Well, we could revise the plan or scope. We could potentially use a concrete that doesn't have a risk. So we use pozzolan concrete, let's say. Or potentially we can revise the plan, so we're going to cure the concrete for a much longer period of time, so that will reduce the risk of shrinkage, or avoid the risk of shrinkage. We can reduce the risk. So what's the risk of a project delay because of funds being reduced, funds running out? Well, that risk can be reduced. The impact of that can be reduced by having a contingency plan or contingency funds. Transfer the risk. The risk of, let's say, I don't know, what's a technical risk? Let's go back to the shrinkage cracks. Well, basically, what if the concrete was subcontracted to another company? That means if there are shrinkage cracks, they have to carry that risk. They are the ones responsible for fixing the cracks. And so it becomes their risk rather than yours. It's been transferred over. Now, depending on what of those three strategies we use, we then need to basically update the probabilities and the impacts of the risk. And then we also need to write up the management plan, how we're going to be managing it, managing the risk. And then with that, we can update the current risk register. And so it's actually a cycle. It goes back to what it was previously. And so often with risk management, you could go through several cycles of risk management to try and avoid transfer risks. So let's look here at an example of avoiding risk. Now, this is where you basically can revise the project plan, the scope of the project even, and basically certain risks will be eliminated. They will be taken out of the risk register. The probability will be reduced down to 0. Now, a lot of risks, they can be completely eliminated at the design stage of a project. And so certain scope changes to the final infrastructure can avoid risk. So often a lot of infrastructure is built stronger than it needs to be. But the reason it's over-designed is basically that while the infrastructure is being built, when it's at its weakest stage, the risk of it collapsing while it's being built is eliminated. So here's just an example. The risk of the ground conditions being hard granite. that will mean that the tunnel boring machine won't be able to cut through. So the management solution is only hire a tunnel boring machine that has the capacity to cut through the hardest rocks we may face. So there was a 25% chance we might hit hard granite, but hey, let's get in a really strong tunnel boring machine just in case we face it. The risk has been eliminated. It's been completely avoided solely because we've spent a little bit more money on the project plan by getting a bigger, stronger tunnel boring machine. Now, reducing risk. This can often be a cheaper solution than avoiding risks. Remember, with the last example, we avoided the risk, but it did mean that we had to get in a bigger, stronger tunnel boring machine. That will have certain costs associated with that. And you could be reducing the probability and the impact of the risk. So, and one of the ways of reducing risk is with technical risks is by having good trained staff. So let's look at an example here of the risk of shrinkage cracks in the concrete. Well, if your concrete workers were well trained in concrete, then the chance of shrinkage happening is going to be reduced, isn't it? The probability is reduced because shrinkage cracks happen when people don't know what they're doing with concrete. Let's look at another risk, the risk that the Ministry of Transport runs out of money for the project halfway through. So I think this was a $20 million impact risk with a 5% probability. Well, one way you could manage this is that the Ministry of Transport, they could get a pre-approved loan from the World Bank. That means if they run out of money, they can get a mortgage from the World Bank, and the World Bank will pay for the rest of the project, and the Ministry of Transport will pay them back at a later stage. So does that reduce the probability of the Ministry of Transport running out of money? No, it doesn't. But what it does is it reduces the impact of them running out of money. Before, where we were looking at big time delays, now there's only going to be very short time delays. The mortgage is pre-approved, so the Ministry of Transport, if they run out of money, they just need to phone up the World Bank and say, hey, we need that loan that we were pre-approved for. Please send us the money right away and send us the paperwork to sign. And then the project can keep going on with minimal delay. So probability hasn't been reduced, but impact has been reduced. Now, the transferring of risk. This is where the risk itself does not actually change. The impact or the probability doesn't change, but it's being passed on to another entity, to another company potentially. Now, this is basically where subcontracting comes into it, where certain work packages, if they are considered high risk, potentially subcontracting the work package out, that means the subcontractor is now carrying the risk. It's no longer a risk for the project team, but for the subcontractor. So it's very important that you have very clear conditions of contract so that the risk is passed over. So an example of this would be the risk that the concrete could crack because of shrinkage. Well, one way you could manage this is you could subcontract the concrete works out. This means that if the concrete does crack, it is the subcontractor's responsibility to fix the concrete at their cost. And so you need to make sure that that's stipulated in the conditions of contract. Make sure that you've got it clear that the concrete must be to a certain standard without shrinkage cracks. And and that if there are shrinkage cracks, the subcontractor must fix them. You've got to make sure it's clear in the conditions of the contract. And also, if there are any time delays, there will be penalties in keeping with the cost of those delays. That's how subcontracting works. Now, another way you can transfer risk is with insurance. This is where you're not transferring a work package, but solely the risk of a work package. So if there are delays because of an earthquake, you can have insurance to cover you for the cost of an earthquake, for example. I'll show you in a slide coming up how insurance works. But yeah, you remember this slide from when we did project planning. Remember, with certain work packages, you can decide, do you do it yourself or do you subcontract? Potentially, if a work package has a high risk, you can transfer that risk over to a subcontractor. Of course, if the subcontractor is carrying risk, he's going to charge you more than if you were doing it yourself. So remember, the more you subcontract, the more the project is going to cost. But there will be less risk being carried by the central project team. So that's how subcontracting works. Now, insurance, there seems to be a lot of misinformation and ambiguity about how insurance works in Kurdistan. And really in Kurdistan, there's the amount of the quality of insurance policies is very poor. So I'm going to try and give you a little example here of how insurance works. Let's say you buy a Land Cruiser. Now, there is a 1% chance you're going to crash the Land Cruiser this year. So there's a 1% chance, and you're going to completely write off the Land Cruiser, and it's going to cost you $60,000. Now, we're not going to look into higher percentages of higher probabilities of smaller crashes and so on and so on. Let's just keep it simple. A 1% chance you completely destroy the Land Cruiser, which cost you $60,000. So what would happen if that risk eventuated? You've got a 1% chance of it happening, and if you crash the Land Cruiser, you don't have another $60,000 in the bank. You just don't. So if you crash the Land Cruiser, that's it. You've lost your Land Cruiser. Now, let's say there's 100 Land Cruiser owners, and they all buy insurance for $1,000 every year each. Now, there was a 1% chance that there would be a crash, so only one of them will crash their Land Cruiser. In that event, the insurance company will pay to get them a new Land Cruiser. The insurance company will pay $60,000. So the impact of the risk of $60,000 is actually shared across all participants. We all pay a little bit of money so that one person who crashes his car can fix his car. And so it's a way of transferring the risk. We're sharing the risk across a bigger body of people. So that's an example of how insurance works. Now, the fact that you're paying $1,000 each, and there's 100 of you, means there's 100,000. Where does the remainder $40,000 go? Well, that goes into the fees for the insurance companies and so on. But they're the company that's organizing this shared cooperation of risk. So that's how insurance works. Now, that's a very rudimentary example of a Land Cruiser, but there are certain risks, such as the risks of natural disasters or even people dying, key designers or key engineers dying that you can get insurance for in a project, in a civil engineering project. So you can get life insurance I've got life insurance, for example, or I will be getting life insurance very soon, in case I die. I get a salary from UKH and from a few other places. Now, if I die, my wife and my daughter, they're going to struggle financially because my wife doesn't work at this stage. And so I'm planning to get life insurance so that if I die, my salary will keep being paid to Sarah, my wife, for a number of years. This is an example of life insurance. The risk of me dying is very low probability, but it's very high impact. And so if we all share that risk and we all buy life insurance policies together, the money that we put in can actually cover the one of us who has the misfortune of dying. So insurance works very well for insurances which are for risks which are high impact and low probability. That's how insurance works. Now, with the risk management plan, there you could actually be writing contingency plans too. So this is basically a plan B. Plan B means contingency plan. What will we do if this happens? So potentially you're not changing the risk, you're not trying to reduce or avoid or transfer the risk, but you're accepting the risk, but you're saying, if this risk happens, what will we do? So this is an alternative to revising plan A. You're basically making a plan B. So this is all written up prior to the risk happening, so that if the risk occurs, the project manager can go to the risk management plan and say, how did we say we were going to deal with this if this came about? And because it's proactive rather than reactive, then it's going to cause a lot less delays and it reduces the impact of the risk. So for example, let's say the chief engineer dies. Well, I think we said that the probability of the chief engineer dying was 10%. We should probably have a plan in place. Well, let's say we have a plan in place where if the chief engineer dies, we're going to hire Yvonne. Now, Yvonne is not currently part of the project team. She's a standalone engineer working on different projects, but we say we're going to hire Yvonne to replace the chief engineer, and she's a great engineer. She'll know what to do. And what we'll also do is maybe we will keep her on standby. That means we will pay a little bit of money to Yvonne so that if we need her, she has to come and work for us. She can't say, sorry, I'm busy with other projects. That's what standby means. And so that reduces the risk of the chief engineer dying. It doesn't reduce the probability, but the impact is reduced. Now, if we get shrinkage cracks in the concrete, we've got a plan. If that happens, we're going to use Selleys concrete crack filler. Selleys is a type of brand it's a brand of products where for concrete treatment they produce all sorts of products for treating concrete. We're going to say we're going to use this product and we're going to fill the cracks. That's our plan B if the cracks emerge. So that's an example of a contingency plan. Guys, that's all I've got on risk management for now. Please know that I've been very, very surface level with risk management. There is a lot more that we could go into with probabilities and interactions where one risk influences another risk. But my goal of this lecture was basically to give you a basic surface level knowledge so that you can be an effective member of a project team and know how a risk management plan works and how a risk register works. This is not enough so that you can actually be involved and in charge of formulating and writing a risk management plan, but you're going to have to do a further reading for that in your own time. Now, a little bit of supplementary reading for you is pages 109 to 122 in Field and Keller's project management book. Again, that's available in the library. This is supplementary. It's not required reading. Everything that I will ask you in the online exam in a couple of weeks' time, that's been covered in this lecture. So listening to this lecture a couple of times and writing good notes, that's enough. So for the exam, at least for your assessment. So guys, I hope you've got a few questions from risk assessment and risk management, and I can talk about those with you and clarify and certain things with you in the tutorial, which will be on Tuesday. Remember, there will be the tutorial. I will be giving you a review of everything that we've covered and everything you need to know for the final exam. Okay, thank you everyone, and goodbye.